Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. Despite the many proclamations that Russian and Chinese interests would collide in Central Asia, Moscow and Beijing continue to work together in service of their shared objectives. These include, most importantly, keeping the United States and the West and democracy out of the region, maintaining stability, and pursuing their economic benefits. Fissures certainly exist, especially in the economic sphere, but so far both countries have sought to prevent these tensions from derailing the broader relationship. Looking forward, the most significant change in Russia-China relations in Central Asia, I would argue, is likely to occur in the security sphere, where China could take on a greater role, especially as Russia's military and security services are preoccupied in Ukraine and with the domestic challenges that the war creates. In addition, both countries may increasingly look to the region as an important building block in their larger effort to build a viable alternative global order. To discuss these issues and more, we're very happy to be joined by Reid Standish and Alex Cooley on today's podcast. Reid and Alex, welcome to you both.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Before we kick off, brief bios. Reid is a Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty correspondent in Prague and author of the China and Eurasia Briefing. And Alex Cooley is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an Academy adjunct faculty member at Chatham House. And one quick note, I want to note that this episode is tied to a new report we've got coming out of the Center for New American Security that's titled Russia and China in Central Asia, Cooperate, Compete, or Deconflict, that we've done with colleagues Lisa Curtis, Kate Johnson, and Nathaniel Shoshet. So we're excited. We've been looking at this issue for the last little while here, but really happy to have Alex and Reid join us for a much broader conversation. I always like to start with kind of the broader scene setting. And so Reid, maybe we can start with you. I think starting this story with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a good place to start. And maybe just to hear from you how you think that invasion, the full-scale invasion, has affected dynamics in Central Asia, like with a focus on the Russia-China dynamic. But I'd also love to hear, and part of this is I know we'll dig into, is how that full-scale invasion has shaped Central Asian views and attitudes towards their relationship with both of these countries.
Yeah, I think, if we're talking about the Central Asian countries themselves, I think that one of the biggest outcomes of the invasion has been, a bit of there's a little more confidence and maybe a little bit more of an energy, especially on the diplomatic front in terms of both engaging together, in terms of maybe having a little more desire to go out, step up their standing if we're looking at other regions, especially outside the West, deepening relations with the Gulf and looking for other sources of investment and things like that. I think the war has really changed the relationship with Russia. And I think, if we look back to, the early days of the invasion a couple of years ago, I think the general thought then would be that, this is going to, undermine Russia's standing in the region quite a bit. It's going to be weakened. The Central Asians are going to be very wary, about what kind of future relations they can have with Russia. And, parts of that are true when we're looking at it today. You can say, Russia's depleted its military capabilities, its stocks. Maybe there's questions about what it can do as a security partner in the region, or compared to how it used to be. But it's not, the pariah in Central Asia. I think maybe there was a few predictions about happening a couple of years ago, right? That's not what's actually happening. If anything, the Central Asian countries, I think, are on a little more equal standing with Russia, and maybe there's a little bit more respect from Moscow towards them, especially if we want to talk about, say, a Kazakhstan or an Uzbekistan, for instance. So I think that's an interesting development, and also given how important Central Asia, Kazakhstan in particular, have become for, getting goods into Russia, whether that's sanctions evasion or just goods coming straight from China that aren't violating sanctions as well. So it's been really important with that. So I think that's been a really interesting development. I think how it's changed things with China and Russia is, it can't really be fully exempt from that broader Beijing-Moscow relationship. They're wedded, for lack of a better term, or perhaps this isn't really a marriage, it's, a very deep situationship or something like that. We can debate that a little bit as we get going, exactly what is going on between Beijing and Moscow. But generally they're on the same page for the big geopolitical questions. And there's a lot of overlap in how they see Central Asia for security and things like that. So generally, actually, I think the story there has been, getting along pretty well, and maybe a bit of an understanding that, okay, as we're looking to, ramp up and dig in for the long term with our, what do we call it, a conflict or a rivalry, a competition with the West, where lines are getting drawn, and perhaps as Central Asia is a region that they would both like to have on their side. I think China, obviously, we had some a big summit a year ago. That was a really big deal to have, a changing face for China to do this, to be engaging with Central Asia, also with cutting Russia out of that equation completely, which didn't always used to be the trend. I think China was a bit deferential to Russia for many years. You've seen, China being, more willing to kind of draw its own lines and say, okay, this is ours, and go for it. And a lot of that's been on the economic sphere. I think the latest stats show, China's trade turnover with Central Asia was around 90 billion last year, which I think is over double what Russia's was with the whole region. And interestingly, within that, half of that, I believe, around half of that was with Kazakhstan alone. So Kazakhstan is really emerging as China's big economic partner. And then if we want to talk more about security, I think that's really settled into Tajikistan, which obviously shares a border both with Afghanistan and with China. There's a lot of questions about terrorism, the role of militant groups there. So I think that's kind of the scene that the last couple of years have brought up. And within that, there's a ton of questions we don't really know the answers to. But, that's kind of where I think we are today.
Yeah. Can it's the same question to you, but I'd love to hear you pull especially on that thread of Russia's relations with the Central Asian states, because Reid is so right. There was this popular narrative earlier in the war that, wow, this is a fundamental change in Russia's relations with these countries. They're going to be so wary. They're going to look to diversify away from Russia more than ever. And I mean, I've heard you talk before, so I know some of the points, but they're really important. So I'd love for you to make them again. Now almost 3 years on, where do you think we are in the way that Russia's invasion has affected its relations, historically close and important relations with these Central Asian states?
Yeah, so I think right after the invasion, I think we were understandably shocked and outraged, and also swayed by the Ukrainian narrative that this was, part of the final decolonization that was necessary from Russia. This idea that this extrication from Moscow didn't want to let go, and in fact was reconquering now by force. It had never gotten over its kind of imperial ambitions. And we thought this might apply to the other post-Soviet states too, right? That they would also see themselves as part of this kind of decolonial push. I think what we see now, or certainly what I see now, is that actually the post-Soviet period mattered a lot in setting up the institutional structures, networks, and incentives for their reactions, right? In other words, it's not a straight line from the end of the Soviet Union to the war. That what was built up in the region over the last 3 decades actually matters a lot, right? Even if perhaps we haven't viewed it as important or legitimate architectures like the CSTO or the Eurasian Economic Union. And I'll give you sort of 2 examples. One is what we saw after the war were massive population movements between Russia and Central Asia, the likes that we haven't seen since the early 90s. And we saw them in both directions. We saw Russians fleeing Russia, first waves, tens of thousands of IT workers, right? Once these various technology companies were banned, setting up across the region, also in the Caucasus and also in Turkey, which actually has helped kickstart a tech boom in the region. And then in the second wave, after conscription, those fleeing mobilization and conscription, right? Tens of thousands more crossing into borders, certainly through Kazakhstan and so forth, going anywhere they could that was sort of visa-free. So that's created a Russian presence in Central Asia that we haven't seen for really a long time. On the other hand, we have also seen enduring labor migration, Central Asia, right? We have a labor shortage in Russia, right, because of everything that's happening. And so, yes, these migrants face a backlash, discrimination. Some of them are even being conscripted. But the ties are quite extensive. And even though they're used as a geopolitical cudgel by Moscow. So that's the person-to-person part is networking. And then what Reid mentioned, sort of response to sanctions, sanctions evasion, sanctions-related rediversion. What we see, a set of networks that are premised upon the kinds of custom spaces, formal and informal networks that existed in the region that are allowing this smuggling to take place. And so, Reid mentioned, Chinese trade with Central Asia is booming. It is. It's more than doubled in the first 2 years of the war in places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, set to keep going up and up this year. But by all accounts, that's just a pass-through for goods getting into Russia, right? So you see
the same trend with Germany too, right? And some other, European.
Exactly. And so we need to think of ourselves, how did this happen so easily? Well, one of the reasons it happened so easily is that we have a customs union, right, within this space. And we also have a set of informal relationships where if things are stamped as going to Kyrgyzstan or to Kazakhstan, they end up in Russia anyway, right? These are the kinds of networks and associations that are actually mattering now. They're just not mattering the way we were ever accustomed of thinking that they were important. On the China-Russia front, I'll just say this. I agree.
But really quickly, I would just to put a finer point on it. Bottom line is, do you think that in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion, the 2022 invasion, that relations between Russia and Central Asia have fundamentally changed, or that Russian influence has declined, or are you suggesting it's evolved, it's changed, but not necessarily any better?
So let me be specific. I think certain types of influence have increased and certain types of influence have declined, right? So the networks of people-to-people ties have increased.
Yeah.
The economic ties have increased. Some of the internal security ties have increased. If you think about it, now you have all these Russians in Central Asian capitals. You give a reason for the FSB to increase its cooperation with Central Asian security services, right? Looking for dissidents, draft dodgers, putting down protests, right? So that space has become more robust as they actively cooperate on these matters. In other ways, though, it has decreased. Culturally, you do see the Central Asian states, right, making a point of their sovereignty, making a point of their history, right? Really trying to create a kind of a multi-vector set of alternatives in their diplomatic spaces to get away from what I call the Russian and Chinese condo. But the other thing that they've learned is over all these decades, in these geopolitical struggles between the Russia and the West, picking sides is usually not healthy for regime stability. Yeah. And so I think above all, they really want to avoid being boxed in. It's a kind of pragmatic neutrality that they want to adhere to, even though, of course, they're concerned about separatist ambitions in, say, northern Kazakhstan. Of course, they're concerned about the role of Russian troops in a place like Dushanbe. But I think overall, it's you don't want to be vocal and you don't want to antagonize your neighbor. That's part of the message too. So the influence is mixed.
Thank you guys so much for coming on, and Andrea for picking this topic and for the work you guys did on this part of the world that not a lot of people follow as closely as they need to. And as I hear you speaking, I'm just more and more interested in this topic and reading the CNAS piece, but particularly listening to what you guys say today. So thank you very much. You don't usually hear Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Trump in the same sentence. But I have to say, maybe some of our our listeners are in this place too, is certainly there's a close relationship potentially, or certainly in the past, and we'll see where it goes between Trump and Putin and Russia. And certainly with Trump in office now, we're going to see a real some upheaval a bit in the transatlantic relationship with some of the European countries, with Ukraine particularly. Russia. It's going to be very interesting to see where all that goes. But in your part of the world, you're talking about Central Asia. What was the reaction about Trump coming in? Was there anything? What do you think Trump coming in might mean for that region vis-a-vis the relationship with Russia? I mean, is there any play that we kind of look for in the next 4 years, or really Trump and his people and what he works on is not going to really roil the waters much over there, and they're going to be watching from afar, just trying to keep their heads down and not get caught in the crossfire. What's the play there in Central Europe with the Trump administration?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I'm just reminded of 2016, early 2017. I was in a different job as a journalist in Washington then, and I can remember, I think it was December 2016. It was a big event that the Kazakh embassy had put on in one of the big hotels, and a lot of, I think you guys have been to DC. There's drinks and a lot of gossip and all of these things going on, and an interesting intersection of policy and lobbyists and oil people and all sorts of stuff going on. But that was granted the chaos of that transition and the lack of planning and stuff that led all to these openings. But the Kazakhs in particular were really quick to capitalize diplomatically. They had through their different connections, with people on the Hill and different kind of lobbyists that had connections to people on the Trump transition team, able to have quite good connections, actually get time, with top advisors and with Trump himself talking about Kazakhstan. That led to the state visit to the White House, which is a big deal. Same thing happened later with Uzbekistan as well. So that kind of transactional nature of Trump, I think, is one that the Central Asian leaderships, they know how to work with. It's a lot simple. They speak a similar language, I think, of diplomacy and politics and things like that. And let's strike a deal, right? So in terms of what that's going to look like, I mean, who knows? But if what I'm thinking, what strikes out to me, I can also remember, several years later, this is near the end of that administration. I was splitting my time between Moscow and Kazakhstan, and I can remember Pompeo making his trip where he stopped in Kazakhstan, which, it's, I think every Secretary of State maybe goes to Central Asia once. But a big focus of that trip was about China. Big time, actually, kind of almost simplistically. And I remember talking to sources, local government sources, from Kazakhstan, almost a little confusing to them too, a bit. Not real fully understanding it. Granted, this was just, a couple of years or still in the throes of everything that was happening in Xinjiang, perhaps seeing that this is a way to kind of, kick up some anti-Chinese sentiment in society, which is always kind of, sprinkled there to varying degrees. And, maybe that's some seeds to plant or things like that. So I think, given perhaps if Trump and, Putin, they can, if there is this kind of rapprochement or warming that we think might be coming or is poised to happen, then that perhaps as a Trump strategy then thinks, okay, well, how can we look to foster a lot more competition between the Russians and the Chinese? Perhaps Central Asia is a region where that happens. And then just in general, looking at, China's growing influence there, how do we start to undercut that? Which perhaps there's some, I think, as Alex was saying, I think the Central Asians don't want to be boxed into China and Russia, as their two broad partners. That's thing I've heard is there's a lot of pressure that especially Kazakhs, but those kind of governments face of, hey, we don't expect you to be only us, but really the West, Americans in particular, someone we would like you to stay away from. If you look at a lot of the big deals that are happening, they're not really going to U.S. companies or things like that, or in a way that maybe, 10, 15, 20 years ago that they would have. So yeah, that's sort of where I see some room for Trump, and maybe he can offer some kind of economic deals or something like that, especially if you think critical minerals, stuff like that in Kazakhstan. I think there's probably a lot of room to do something there.
Yeah, I would say Trump is very popular in Central Asia in terms of style, in terms of also the transactional focus, both amongst the leaders and the population. Also, de emphasizing the quote unquote liberal values issues, right? Human rights, democracy. They're very happy about that, not being called out. Also, um, hope for some sort of sanctions relief so that state connected entities aren't made examples of, right, and targeted by OFAC. That's not something they've pushed in many cases, but they would much rather have that also go away. I want to pick up on this visit that Reid talked about because it was a really interesting geopolitical episode. What it signaled at the time was that there were a number of shifts going on in U.S. foreign policy. The first,
this is the Pompeo visit.
Yeah, the Pompeo visit.
Yeah,
early in the Trump administration. The first was a completely different view of Chinese infrastructure in the region. Prior to this, under Obama, U.S. policy was to support Chinese infrastructure in the region under the kind of perspective that this is strengthening local and regional sovereignty. It's offering options that aren't Russian, that more connectivity wherever it comes from is relatively good. And you saw a much more critical approach in the Trump administration towards questions of strategic corruption, sort of governance in many parts of the world, not just sort of Central Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so forth, right? So that's like a 180 shift that happens there. And then on the values front, the other message Pompeo sends is not so much on general democratization, human rights, but on the Uyghur situation. Right? We have the Uyghur Protection Act that gets passed here by all accounts. Trump didn't particularly like it, but he signed it. And we go through this phase where support for the Uyghurs becomes the values issues in the region, which makes the Kazakhs especially very uncomfortable. Right? Because they're trying to fend off this Chinese pressure about the education camps. A couple of Kazakh NGOs that actually were quite popular were eventually sort of shut down, that were advocating on behalf of co-ethnic Kazakhs who would pass through the camps. There were thousands of them. So I think they would also prefer not to be a kind of a pawn or be pressured to take an anti-Chinese platform. Right? I think that's the thing that they'll be most concerned about in a Trump administration. I think they welcome some sort of stability reconciliation with Russia, ending the war and so forth. But they also, I think, are very wary of the sort of U.S.-Chinese competition going forward.
Yeah, there could be quite an interesting dynamic, a warming relationship with Russia, perhaps kind of deteriorating or, consistently intense relationship with China. And I guess I want to pick up on something that you said, Reid, is, maybe Trump and people around him who are looking at the growing cooperation between Russia and China, but also Iran and North Korea, could come back to this idea that Central Asia is an opportunity to drive a wedge. I mean, it's been this tempting idea for a very long time. And people have always talked about, well, they're not aligned in every way and they compete in Central Asia. So aren't there things that we can do there to try to sow these divisions to them? Is that a winnable approach in Central Asia? Hopefully I'm leading the witnesses sufficiently.
My 2 cents would probably, immediate thought would be probably not. I think especially if you're talking on like the government diplomatic level, I think that's something that, as Alex was saying also, I think the Central Asians don't really want to be forced to pick a side. They don't want to get caught in the crossfire of this bigger geopolitical competition, especially that they see the Americans and the Chinese in. And so, I'm just trying to think, what would be those areas where you could drive a wedge between, Russia and China there. And, there isn't a ton there that maybe things that can develop organically, certainly, sure. But in terms of what an external force like the U.S., especially one that, America is still largest, most powerful country in the world, but, it's quite far away. Its engagement with Central Asia is always a bit haphazard and lopsided and all of these things like that. So I just don't see a ton there. personally that not like I can't actually off the top of my head really think of anything that would be a big opening, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think this argument has been made periodically, and for good reason, right? You see, Central Asia used to be part of Russia's sphere of influence, and now China moved in, first economically, now in terms of security. And I think people, quite understandably, analysts look at the region and say, well, when is Moscow going to wake up, right? And see that its influence is being curtailed, that the region's being rewired, right? Through this infrastructure, this technology transfer. I think the thing to understand, though, is that even with all these crises, and let's be clear, Central Asia has hosted a number of crises and bouts of political instability over the last few years that we always talked about, and now it's actually happening. But what's happening as a result of them is that China and Russia kind of work things out in response, right? Give you an example. Before Russia's invasion, we had the demonstrations in Kazakhstan in January, right? Sort of, the rioting. It turned out to be also a proxy internal struggle between Tokayev and the previous sort of family. And we get a request for CSTO intervention. And for the first time, the Russian-led CSTO goes into Kazakhstan, right? Everyone's taken aback because they always refuse. They refused Kyrgyz invitations. They refused Armenian invitations. But this one's drawn up for them. They went, they guarded symbolic targets. They were invited in. And then they actually left, right? And so it was a kind of a regime stability operation, basically sort of signaling, we support Tokayev, right? We're here sort of for stability. And there wasn't a lot of public comment from China right when that was going on. But then a couple of weeks later, they came out with a statement saying that they supported this, that they are all for sort of stabilizing the region, that there is, room for all of these different kinds of regional organizations, right? Whether it's CSTO, SCO, sort of bilateral initiatives, the new kind of China Central Asia mechanism that comes up later. So I think what you see is because exactly what Reid said, they value their kind of cooperation pushing back against U.S. leadership ordering in the world. That when something that like this happens that might potentially drive a wedge, they adjust, right? And ultimately, Chinese and Russian security interests aren't incompatible in the region. Russia wants to project that its territory, wants to have bases in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Of course, it's concerned about instability, spillover from Afghanistan. But China's concerned about Xinjiang. It has good working relationships now on the Uyghur issues, and it's transferring all its technology, smart city technology, surveillance technology, straight into these Central Asian capitals, right? So it's really upped its intelligence gathering. And it also has a network of private security actors that are actively working now to guard its infrastructure investments. So those different security mechanisms aren't really conflicting. They're just kind of overlapping. And because the relationship is such a priority, Moscow and Beijing seem to be okay to mutually accommodating each other.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we highlight in the paper, like recognizing that, there could be tensions, particularly in the security realm where Russia has been the long-term kind of security provider of choice. And that Russia might bristle at China's growing security footprint. All the things you said, this like little outpost on the Tajik border. I mean, there has over the last many years been an uptick in China's security presence. And one of the things we highlight in the paper is like, especially while Russian forces are degraded and bogged down in Ukraine, one could imagine that if something happens, whether it's one of these brittle regimes suffer another bout of instability, or as you were talking about, Alex, more, spillover from Afghanistan, Russia will be hard pressed to deal with that. And China could step into that role. And I still think, while the war continues, that as long as China is doing things that are consistent with Russia's aims in the region, I don't think there would be much reaction from Moscow, and in fact would probably be welcome. So, I mean, we have always tried to find these different fissures and is this going to be the thing? But your point, Alex, is exactly what we the same conclusion we draw in the paper, which is they are going to work very hard to compartmentalize any little bits of frustration to prevent it tainting the larger, much more important kind of geopolitical relationship, which has taken on even greater importance in the aftermath of the invasion. But Jim, I know you wanted to toss in a question.
Thanks so much. This is just fascinating. I can't wait to read that CNAS paper. Maybe I can get an advanced copy.
Just saying that, Jim.
No, I'm not. I'm feeling like, gosh, I wish I would have had a hand in it, but I don't think I would bring much to the table, unfortunately. But I just think it's going to be great. I hope you make it into a movie, though. I think it would be a cool movie.
You can play, Tokayev, or maybe, I don't know.
A Tom Cruise-like character is usually that's my go-to. Anyway, let me take you all a little bit afield, but again thinking about how events in the region ripple into Central Asia. You know, one of the axis of upheaval, the famous CNAS name, another tip of the hat to Andrea, but a key player in that axis of upheaval is Iran. And I think what we're starting to see now is a really interesting situation where the Israelis, this strike that they just took, really showed that Iran is just vulnerable to whether it's air attack or whatever it might be. I'm sure Tehran right now is realizing they're almost standing naked out there, able to be manipulated by anyone that shows they've got a capable air force. Their air defense has now been wiped out. And so they're in a very different place than where they were, Iran. Very different place than where they were. And they're, of course, a very influential player in that region. Not just we heard about Hezbollah and Lebanon, but it's not just there, but in other places as well. Some are saying that this vulnerability that Iran has now demonstrated could lead to them to really accelerate efforts to go nuclear, or at least to make such progress that that potential could be right around the corner. Just to show people who, like the Israelis, who might want to do something about that vulnerability, that not to mess with them. So, I mean, this isn't something where they're going to have a deliverable nuclear weapon in the next couple of months. But I think, but there could be something where they've got to show a strength or an ability, and showing great progress on a nuclear weapon could do that potentially. We might see that. So if that were to happen, and particularly if down the road they in fact demonstrate a nuclear capability, how does that ripple into Central Asia? I mean, it's in their backyard. There's relations there between Iran and the Central Asian nations. I would think that for Central Asia, the security equation for them has to be impacted by the Middle East and has to be impacted by what Iran does. Is that true? Would we see something like that, or would they just add that to their complex security situation with everything else? It just wouldn't have that much of a ripple effect to them.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in some ways the puzzle of Iranian Central Asian relations is almost, why hasn't Iran actually tried to forge or rather exert even more influence in the region, right? Given its geographic location, its size. And I think there's a couple of things going on. Iran has made forays and ventures into Tajikistan. It actually has also provided aid programs. It's built, I think, a couple of tunnels. But there's unease there about Iranian influence. Other Central Asian countries have working relationships on certain issues. So Turkmenistan and Iran, right? Swap energy, right? And have working relations there. The geopolitical dimension that you refer to now, and adding the potential sort of networking of Russian-Iranian ties, as well as what's happening now in terms of its proxy war with Israel, further complicates things. But it's not something the Central Asian states are going to really want to be involved in or actively court. And in fact, the whole fear with Iran has been trying to keep them at arm's length because there is this concern about religious influence, networks, funding of militias, all this sort of kind of stuff that might sort of happen as a result. So even though there's geographic proximity there, ties have never been robust, right? Certainly not at the level that you might think. The other one, and I'll be curious to hear Reid's take on this too, I'm thinking about now is what does North Korea's entrance into the war do for sort of Central Asian reactions, right? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan have very dense ties with Korean communities. You have Korean diaspora, business entrepreneurs. You have very robust relations between the two countries. How does this complicate, right, those kinds of relationships? I think that's another interesting outcome of the kind of, extra regionalization of what's happening.
I didn't know that about the North Korea connections, but one ingredient to throw into the mix on the Iran question, and then Reid over to you, is also the SCO. And so now it's, obviously Russia and Iran have really forged much closer relationship in the aftermath of the invasion, particularly in the security domain. But it strikes me that Russia and China together are using some of these diplomatic multilateral forums to kind of reputation wash, kind of normalize, bring Iran back in from the cold. And certainly they've done that in SCO and also with the BRICS. But now, there is now, through this multilateral organization, more Iranian presence and at least interactions at the leader level. So I wonder, again, I don't know exactly what to do with that, but it does enter into the equation that way as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, I have a couple of things because everybody touched on so many interesting things that I want to pick up. The thought that jumped into me with, Jim, for what you asked about with Iran and stuff. So if we are, if Iran is looking to go nuclear very soon, I'm reminded of, in the lead up to the nuke deal, the Kazakhs, as a country that gave up their nuclear weapons, that's a big part of their foreign policy history. Big part of their diplomacy, staged at the UN. When that was going on, they were offering to be, a nuclear fuel bank and do all sorts of things like that. So then it strikes me perhaps there's some diplomatic opportunities, but this is also a very different world, than it was when all of that was going on over a decade ago, right? Maybe we're past the stage where those kind of talks can take something on and be an off ramp. On the North Korea stuff, I think, to me, that's what happens. How does Seoul react to this, right? There's some, obviously they've been going around to, Brussels and DC, intelligence officials sharing everything that they see. We've seen some comments about, maybe Seoul wants to actually step up the type of aid it's giving to Ukraine. Obviously the ultimate wild card that's going to rewrite all of this is, what does Trump decide to do on Ukraine and what direction does that go? I think that kind of creates a little bit of a paralysis right now for a lot of countries not wanting to do any big moves or anything like that, not knowing what's going to come, starting in January. And so, I think, looking at SEO and BRICS like that, where, I think that's a correct thing to say. Of there's kind of a reputation washing that those apply for Iran. But one thing that also, there's so many layers to those organizations. It's sort of, there's the level of, are you Beijing, Moscow, who's, using this to really maybe portray a bit of this kind of non-Western global infrastructure. Look at, all of our kind of countries that we invite to the table that represents, this amount of GDP and geography and all of these types of things. But, there's other countries who are just kind of there, kind of to be there a bit, or also sort of sometimes there to be a bit of a spoiler and drag their feet on things. And especially if I look at, something like BRICS is, you have countries who are there because they see it as this really viable thing. Others who are there who are also part of all sorts of other organizations as well, and actually quite close to them. It's just kind of this geopolitical hedging sort of thing that they're doing. And, like speaking within that, what will look at how the Kazakhs, approach these things where they're quite engaged in SEO. They just hosted it in the summer, but also then this whole thing that happened just with the BRICS summit of actually not wanting to join and kind of saying, actually, we'll think about this later. In part, I think, because maybe that's like too anti-Western of them to maybe get used as a bit of a cudgel that way. I think it's probably something that they were worried about.
Do you think that was the main factor that led them to kind of say, give a no to the BRICS membership or to the invitation? I mean, I don't know if either of you have a view on why Kazakhstan would have chosen to. I mean, there were a handful of other countries, right? Argentina said no. There were a few others, but I guess I was surprised to see Kazakhstan.
Well, they also kind of, they didn't quite, it's sort of just a no for now, right? Because I think they did join this, membership in waiting initiative. Yeah. So, maybe in a couple of years, the world looks very different and it makes sense that this is the right move. But I think the calculation out of Astana is just, there's so much uncertainty right now. Do we really want to get brought here? Who knows what's going to happen with the US, with the West, what Russia's trajectory is. Maybe it's best to just, again, not get caught in the crossfire.
Yeah. And the Kazakhs maintain robust ties, not only with the EU as a trading partner, but South Korea, as we mentioned, Japan, that's an important relationship. So the kind of diplomatic balancing there is something they really look out for. I think one of the other problems that you see in these organizations, it depends on, what our metrics for their success is, right? We tend to grade very strictly with regional organizations. And we say, well, unless we're seeing like supranationalism, right? Sort of states willingly integrating, ceding their sovereignty, like robust sort of regional commissions, this kind of thing, then it's just sort of talk shop. And well, maybe, but having a form is important, right? In the sense of sort of shifting the diplomatic center of gravity, right? And I know the Chinese take a very long-term view on this. Russia takes a very short-term view on this. They want these organizations to issue anti-Western declarations about Ukraine, before that about Syria, about all of these issues that they have grievances in. And all the countries know this, right? And so there's always this kind of how much to sort of placate the anti-Western agenda while not sort of, putting up the sort of red flags. And you saw this also in terms of discussing a kind of non-dollar payment system, which is, of course, Putin's great kind of aspiration coming out of this. Other problem you have is on the SCO side, by integrating into the South Asian space, when Pakistan and India were invited, now India serves as a counter to China, right? So the SCO actually, even though this was started by China, it can't issue declarations on Belt and Road, right? Or some very basic sort of Chinese priorities. They're very sensitive about the SCO, so they will always support it. They will always talk about its importance, view it as a status symbol. But what you've seen is sort of the Chinese in parallel now have set up all these other mechanisms for dealing with Central Asia, because they now see that with India in there, kind of a lot of kind of stuff that they wanted to do is either happening bilaterally or through some of these different kinds of mechanisms.
Maybe one last question. When you're looking at Russia-China relations or this axis of upheaval, the kind of common pushback to people who are skeptical of kind of the depth and durability of the relationship is often something along the lines of, well, we know what they oppose, but they don't stand for anything. They don't have a positive agenda. They don't share a common vision of the world. And I guess my question to you both is, do you think that Russia and China share a similar vision for Central Asia? Like, is this like could you think of this region as a smaller building block or an opportunity for them to demonstrate that they can kind of cooperate in a region, share a common vision, and kind of like this is like a test case almost. And I guess I'll put my cards on the table to say, like, to me, I think you can start to see at least some broad contours of a more positive and agreed vision. And I think of things like, in the SCO, like the statements about indivisible security, or, that one country can't take an action that makes another country. That's what Putin used in large part to justify his invasion of Ukraine. That language is now in many of these Chinese documents. There's other things, but so over to you. I mean, do you think there is overlap in a positive vision, at least for Central Asia? And what would it be?
To me, as I think there's that talk about the shared condominium. Perhaps this isn't something that's fully built. We see the outside structure, or maybe it's not going to be a condo. It's more of a gazebo or something. There is something shared there getting built. And to me, it's mostly that this is not going to be a region of Western influence. This is going to be part of this new alternative global center that China is trying to build up, and that Moscow is also part of. And that's sort of the role where Central Asia can fit into that. In terms of things that they could build together to really showcase, I think a lot of that maybe depends on how the war in Ukraine shakes out. If this, if this gets dragged on for several years and Russia's still in there, it's, I think that tilts things in China's favor even more, and perhaps then allows China to perhaps do things a little more on its terms and its side, and maybe Russia will be, have less opportunities and ability to push back on some of that stuff and undermine it. So I think we're a little bit of wait and see there. But, again, the big thing of overlap to me is security, is counterterrorism, which, interestingly enough, as much as the Chinese and the Russians are doing military exercises together, in places like, in Eastern Asia, close to Japan and Taiwan and things like that, there actually hasn't been a ton of joint stuff in Central Asia itself between the Russians and the Chinese on a security military level, like actually in it itself, which I always find kind of interesting and revealing. So, maybe that's something that could be pushed for in the future, but I think that will depend a little bit on what happens in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think, there aren't direct contours or vectors of clashing either on the security or the economic front that I can see in the foreseeable future. Very interestingly, when the U.S. was pulling out of Afghanistan, by all accounts, Beijing and Moscow took a very hard line with the Central Asian states not to allow facilities to the U.S. military for withdrawal, right? And it was a real contrast. It was 20 years below when they both signed on to a U.S. military basing presence in the region, each for different reasons, right? So they agreed on that. So that exclusion of the U.S. also isn't just symbolic, right? I mean, it's real, and there's sort of concern there. But I think for the most part, China views Central Asia as an extension of a lot of its domestic security imperatives, its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, the Xinjiang issue, and potential sort of instability. Russia wants to sort of project this idea that this is its neighborhood. It's the basis on which it views itself as a great power in a multipolar world. Now, do I think the multipolar world that Russia aspires to be in of the 19th century is the way the world's going to look like? No, I don't think so at all. But it's not in China's interest to say no either, right? If the Russians want to think that, right, then it's really relatively low cost for sort of China to give them that kind of prestige, because look what they do anyway. They still cooperate with Central Asia on security. They still build their infrastructure. They still get massive territorial adjustments in terms of just amputating whole parts of the Tajik mountain range, right, once in a while. So, what's lacking in terms of Chinese sort of potential aspirations and goals that they're not getting now? Now, maybe they'll become more aggressive in the future. Maybe they'll really sense Russian weakness and pounce on it. But I think for now, there's enough gravity shift happening towards the east that they're pretty content with the arrangement.
Yeah. And I guess I would add, Reid, you listed some of the things where I think they share interests, but obviously this idea of state-based rights, or, that human rights aren't universal, democracy isn't something that can be universally defined. So again, I know there's not a lot there that is a shared vision, but I think if you had asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I would have found it harder to give an answer. But now when you start this indivisible security, Russia talks about the global majority in a very similar way that China has a much longer term, global something for all of mankind. the state-based rights, definitions of democracy, you can start to see some of the contours of what they could agree on and aspire to in the future. So again, I fully admit it's like the earliest stages, but I think we just can't constantly dismiss that, well, they don't share a common vision, because, looking back at research, and when you have shifts from a single to a competing world order, oftentimes at the beginning, the competing countries are more aligned in what they oppose. They understand what they want to tear down. And it's only over time that they kind of hash out this more positive vision. So I think we all need to be paying attention, at least, and understanding we could be moving more in that direction and what that would mean. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but just to say, I think this has been a really excellent conversation. As Jim said, I think the region doesn't get all that much attention, but there are really interesting and important things happening, and really thankful that you are willing to take your time to share your views and expertise.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has just been super.
Thanks for having us on.
Great thanks very much. It was awesome. Thanks.
Reid and Andrea, and meet you, Jim. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.